Hi, my name is Ellen Goldey, and I'm going to be guiding you through a webinar called Designing a Sensor or Sencerized Model in about 90 minutes. I've been working with the Sensor Summer Institute for over 10 years now, and quite frankly, that's really all you need to know about me because this webinar is going to engage you in a workshop, and I want to encourage you to be ready to stop the webinar at any time. There are going to be some suggested time limits for each of the slides that you see so that you could actually finish and have a product within 90 minutes. But I'll point out now it'll be a lot better for you and your teams to actually have more time. So 3 hours would be my recommendation, maybe even a half day or a full day if you can find that time. But I'm working under the assumption that most of us don't have that kind of time, so carve out that 90 minutes, and I think you'll have a good product. One of the things that I want you to do before you actually get started on the rest of this webinar is to print out the one-page heuristic called Designing a Sensor or Sencerized Model that's available as a PDF attachment for this webinar. You also are going to need a stack of Post-it notes, the 2x2 size, or a similar size stack of scrap paper that you can use in the brainstorming activity that we'll get started in just a few minutes. You also need some felt tip markers, fairly broad stroke markers, because I'm going to ask you to actually write ideas down, one idea per Post-it note. And using the felt tip markers is going to allow everybody else to see those ideas as you sort of think about them as a group. One more thing you're going to need is a sheet of newsprint or poster size sheet of paper so that you can actually have your poster as a final product that you share with the other teams that are engaging in this exercise with you. I suggest that you also identify somebody that's going to keep track of time and keep things moving along. That's one of the downsides of doing this as a webinar instead of doing it in person. When we're doing it in person, I'm that timekeeper and I keep everybody moving along. I'm not always everybody's favorite person because I'm always interrupting. But unless you do that, you might get bogged down and not finish the activity. So a bit of overview for our work in the webinar today. We're going to use this heuristic that hopefully you now have printed out. We're going to model an example of engaging pedagogy that you might actually use in your coursework or in other kinds of workshops with faculty members. And ideally, I want to encourage you, as the last item on this list, but maybe the first priority in my mind, is to encourage students to engage with you in this activity. Students bring a lot of energy and creativity to this work, but they also, perhaps even more importantly, when you're working with students seated at your table and treating them as partners in the process, you tend to be a lot more polite to each other than you might be if the students weren't present. At least that's been my experience. So the first thing I want you to do is to form a team, and you're going to group yourselves into, my recommendation is teams of 3 to 4 people, like you see in the picture below. And a team of 3 or 4 works really well. I suggest that you consider mixing people from different disciplines. It's great to actually mix strangers. A good way for a campus to get to know each other just a little bit better if you actually work outside of your department. Every department has its own, for lack of a better word, baggage that they bring to a workshop like this. And so if you split everybody up, chances are you're going to move away from some of the preconceived notions that you might have about an activity like this if you're working with somebody in a different field. You should identify at least one person in the team that's going to take really good notes so that you can use those notes when it comes time to actually develop your poster. I recommend that you actually stop the webinar now, and if you're trying to complete this webinar in 90 minutes, I'm going to recommend that this takes just 3 minutes to actually form your team. Moving on. Once you've introduced yourself, I would suggest that perhaps one way to break the ice for this group is to actually share one aspirational goal that you have for all of your students. And again, sharing your name, your professional role, and your affiliation to a particular department. Spend a little time using this activity to get to know each other, what areas of expertise you're bringing to this workshop. And again, I suggest that you stop the webinar at this point and take that time. The next activity is going to be brainstorming a list of wicked problems. And the book that I have in this slide, Tackling Wicked Problems, and the authors are Brown, Harris, and Russell. And they describe wicked problems in the following ways. These wicked problems are multi-causal, they're constantly changing, and we never have enough evidence to actually solve the problem. We're always gathering more, but if we wait to act, that's a problem. They're highly resistant to any particular solution. Oftentimes, the truth claims that people make about a wicked problem are in conflict across the different stakeholders. They tend to be the responsibility of numerous agencies and groups, and the resolution requires changing long-standing behaviors. And finally, good solutions to these kinds of problems require what's called the transdisciplinary imagination. You have to think outside any one particular discipline and think very broadly if we're going to tackle the world's biggest wicked problems. So what I'm going to ask you to do is each person on your team contribute at least 3 wicked problem ideas and write each idea down on a separate sticky note or scrap paper using one of those bold markers so that everybody can see those ideas. Don't comment on each other's ideas now. Just take a couple of minutes of silent brainstorming to come up with lots and lots of ideas. Put each idea out on the table in front of you so that everybody can see them, and let them build up for the next couple of minutes. I've got a few examples: climate change, malaria, HIV, malnutrition. All of those are the types of problems that you might brainstorm now. So again, stop the webinar now so that you can get some of those ideas down on paper. We're back in action again, and so what I want you to do now is to actually come to consensus on one of those wicked problems. So I suggest that each person look at all of the ideas that are now on the table in front of you. Pick a favorite that you might argue that your team actually pursues for the rest of the workshop, and listen closely to each person's favorite idea without making a lot of negative comments. Let them have a chance to talk about why they think that's a good idea so you really understand what it is that they find so interesting about it. And then the hardest part now is to try to come to consensus on one of these ideas, or perhaps you see a trend toward a grouping or cluster of ideas that might lead to a new title for your wicked problem that would be more of an umbrella title for many of the ideas on the table. But you're trying to reach consensus now, and if consensus is difficult, I suggest that you just take a leap of faith, settle on one of the ideas, because it's going to work for this workshop and you're going to come up with a really cool model. And again, now if you'd like to stop the webinar, the suggested time is 5 minutes for this activity, but obviously it can be longer if you think that that's what's necessary. The next part of our activity is going to be identifying your student audience and the structure of the model that you're going to be using. So if you're following along with the heuristic now, we're actually on the item number 5 on that heuristic, and you're going to identify now where that model falls within the curriculum or the co-curriculum. Do you want this model to actually be part of a course, or do you want it to be an entire course, or perhaps you want it to be an overarching theme that runs through several courses? Do you want it to be directed at freshman students, first-year students, or senior students? Maybe it's a capstone project, or maybe you want to focus on sophomores. It's up to you at this point. And again, consensus can be difficult within the team, but I know that you'll work on that and identify your student audience. And again, you don't want to spend too long on this activity, so you can stop the webinar now. I suggest about 5 minutes. Our next step starts getting a little bit more difficult in some ways because we want to prioritize what are the outcomes that we want for students as a result of this SENCERized module or model or whole course, whatever it is that you've decided this is going to be. And the way that I like to think about this for my own courses, and this has certainly been recommended by other course developers, is to focus on answering these questions. What knowledge do you want students to have at the end of this course? What skills do you want for them? And what dispositions do you hope that they develop as a result of participating within this model? I suggest that you commit to at least one desired outcome from each of those categories. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to be able to do? And what do you want them to care about as a result? I've added in your handout that you downloaded, the second page of the handout is actually what I refer to as Table 1 here. And this table was actually developed by my colleagues and I at Wofford College as we were considering redesigning our first-year curriculum in biology. So as you scroll through our ideas, feel free to borrow freely from these ideas, but you're certainly not restricted to these. If you don't see what you really want students to be able to know, do, and care about in this course, you can add your own. So I'm going to go back to the other screen and suggest that you spend about 12 minutes on this. This could take much longer, and this is one of those places where I really think that it might be best to spend a larger amount of time on this particular step. So again, stop the webinar now so that you have time to work on this particular activity. The next step in the process is that we're actually going to envision implementation of this course. There's a lot of research, I'm sure you're aware of, that we need to use more engaging pedagogies in our classroom. It's not to say that lectures don't work well sometimes, but if that's all we're doing, we probably aren't as knowledgeable as we should be about the research that shows that active learning leads to much longer retention and that students learn best when they are actually teaching themselves. So think through what kinds of engaging pedagogies you might use. Another possibility is to think about what kinds of experiments you might want students to employ. What research will they actually be conducting? And is it actually open-ended and what we refer to as authentic research? Or does it have, pretty pat answers, and might we rethink maybe what the research might look like if that's the case? Metacognition is really important as well. Students need to be aware of their learning and how they learn best. What strategies do they need? So we might embed some metacognitive strategies in this course. What community-based research might they do? SENCER is all about civic engagement. How can we actually get students to be civically minded and to practice some of that kind of work so that they feel empowered as graduates to go on and do the good work that our institutional mission says that they're going to do? What technologies might support this work, and what resources, and I'd say not just including people, but especially people, might you bring into the classroom, or might they meet with, or might we go out into a community and have students collecting information from people who are actually impacted by the problem that you've identified? All of these ways are ways that we actually deepen the meaning of the courses that we do and engage students in really wanting to learn. So this could take quite a bit of time to do this kind of work. Estimated here is 20 minutes, but again, you could spend several hours on this part or even several days, and I think that's okay too. You could stop it now, come back to the webinar, and finish up the next parts, but the next parts are also really important. Our next step is to actually develop the assessment plan. And you need to develop the assessment plan before you actually offer the course for the first time or the model that you've developed. How are you going to know whether or not the students have actually reached the outcomes that you sought for them? How are you going to recognize how you might improve the model the next time you use it? An assessment is key in understanding those steps, and closing the loop of assessment, as it is in the assessment world lingo, is very important, and that means reflecting on the evidence so that you can continuously improve. And I think the best way to do that is to blend direct and indirect assessment methods so that you have really deep insight into the learning of your students. I've developed this assessment overview that you'll actually find in Table 2 of the handout. And it's set up as direct measures, exams, performance tasks, homework assignments. And I would say that this kind of work at the classroom level, this is where we live. This is where we have some expertise as professors. And sometimes we need to think about maybe how are we going to design our exams so that they hit higher order cognitive skills, for example. But we're pretty good at the direct measures. At the program or department or institution level, there are some other types of testing that we can do if we really want to look at some broader impact, but I'm not going to focus on those here, but they're here just for your information because most of them cost money. And at the indirect measures that often can occur at the program or department level include inviting an external consultant or reviewer, or getting our colleagues, if you have an institutional research office, to actually analyze and mine some of the data that we already have, such as from the NESE, if you're a NESE or a SESE school. And if you don't know what those terms mean, that IR office might be even more important to you to find out. But all those tools also tend to be resource intensive. But the ones that I'm going to bring to your attention now to think about are the indirect measures that you can adapt to your classroom that are free. And those include the SALG, which is the Student Assessment of Learning Gains, the CURE, which is the Classroom Undergraduate Research Experience Assessment. The AAC and U value rubrics are very helpful, and there are also lots of knowledge surveys, course evaluations, reflective essays are excellent ways to get at what your students are thinking throughout the course. And then, of course, there's the language of formative versus summative assessment, that formative assessment that you gather and collect throughout the course, and the summative assessment that might be done at the end of the course or at the end of the module that you've developed. I'm going to be using this graphic here to just show what we did in this introductory biology course, just to give you an idea of how we organized our direct assessment methods and our indirect assessment methods, to give you an idea of what kinds of tools that we used. But having a pretty good balance of both is really what I'm suggesting that you do. We tend to focus on those direct methods, but I really am recommending that you bring in some of those indirect methods as well. The Student Assessment of Learning Gains website can be reached at www.salgsite.org. And there is an existing SENCER SALG that you might be interested in taking a look at, but you can also develop your own questions. And the challenge is to develop questions that aren't ambiguous to students, and that might take some collaboration, perhaps with one of the social scientists on your campus, but the SALG is a really, really powerful tool to gather great information, both quantitatively as well as qualitative feedback from your students, and I recommend it to you. And I'm going to show you just a little bit about how we have used the SALG. So for example, what you see here is the SALG evidence from the introductory biology course that we redesigned. The black bars show the course before we made any changes to it, and the gray bars represent the new course. Each year it's been taught since we first implemented the course in that first gray bar year, which was 2009. And the question that they were asked to reflect on, or the stem of the question on the SALG, was, as a result of this course, what gains did you make in these skills? And you see across the side then, you see the perceptions that the students had. And so this is why this is an indirect assessment. It is the students' perceptions that are being evaluated here, not their direct knowledge. 1 is no gains, and the scale to 5 would be great gains. And then along the bottom, you actually see the questions in their abbreviated form, and the students were asked, did they develop gains in using evidence, identifying data patterns, reading the primary literature, etc. And what you see then is that if there is a different letter, that the findings were significantly different from one year to the next. And I'll just draw your attention, for example, to reading the primary literature, where we see great gains over time. And what that is showing is that in that third year, we made a really concerted effort as a team of instructors. There are 7 of us that teach this introductory course. We worked really hard on thinking through how can we make them even better at reading the primary literature. We felt like it worked, and what was very comforting to us is that the students perceived it as well. Writing in the discipline has been one of the things that we had no focus on before we changed the course, and now we're seeing very strong gains from the students' perspective in writing in disciplinary style. They're doing that in the form of research posters in our course. The other example that I recommend to you is the CURE survey, and what you see here are the CURE results from that same course that we didn't use the CURE until last year in 2012. And we are showing here we're showing here the green boxes are all students across the country that take the CURE survey. The blue asterisks are the students that have actually taken the very similar SURE survey, which is the Summer Undergraduate Research Experience survey. And then the students in our introductory biology course are the red triangles. And what I'm going to recommend to you is that I wish that I had known about the CURE survey back in 2008 when we were first planning our changes, because I would have used a lot of these questions to guide us in engaging in backwards course design. All right, so that's a little bit of background on assessment. So now I want you as a team to start thinking about matching your assessment plan to the outcomes that you seek for students. And again, trying to blend both those direct and indirect methods are going to yield the deepest insight into the effectiveness of your program. 10 minutes, honestly, is not enough to do this well, but if we're going to finish this in 90 minutes, that's how much time you have for this part of the product. All right, and now I'm going to ask you to shift gears, and hopefully you've taken good notes. And I'm going to ask you now to actually get that big sheet of paper and your markers out, and whatever creative skills that you think you're going to bring to the table, and actually prepare a poster that's going to summarize for the broader audience. If you have at least a couple of teams, hopefully, that are participating in this together, you're going to then share your posters with each other. And so take some time now to actually make a visual aid that describes the model that you have developed. And I'm going to suggest that you have 10 to 15 minutes for this, but obviously you could take a longer period of time if you have it. And you can stop the webinar now so that you have that time. And finally, take just a couple of minutes and share your poster with the other teams that have worked on this project with you. Select a spokesperson or 2, or maybe the whole team wants to get up and talk about your model. If you're under the time constraints of the 90 minutes, though, no team should take more than 2 minutes to share your poster. But again, if you have more time, then it can become a really great question and answer session after each poster is presented. And I encourage you to do that. I think you are going to be inspired, as I am each time I do this with a live audience. You can see the pictures just now from the SENCER Summer Institute of 2014, where people were sharing their posters with each other, and it was a really delightful opportunity to see all of the creativity and the strong desire that we all have to engage our students in ways that really make a difference. So congratulations for completing this webinar, and if you have any desire to forward your product to me, I always would love to see it. My email is my last name and my initials, Goldeyes, it comes out to goldeyes@wofford.edu. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope to see you at some SENCER Summer Institute in the future. Bye-bye.